Let me talk about innovation in healthcare more broadly, because healthcare, is, as you know, right, it's a sixth of the economy in the United States and growing, and it covers many different aspects of subsectors within the healthcare ecosystem. So when you think about pharmaceutical innovation, that has gone through different eras of innovation, right? If you dial the clock back, 50, 60 years ago, antibiotics was a massive innovation, right? That changed the course of human history and the quality of life. And of course, that was way back even, well before we were all born. The innovation that has been relevant over the last, several decades, first of all, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of innovation around what I would call really chemistry-oriented innovation. So this was medicinal chemistry, high throughput screening, but the ability to really understand targets in the human body and then find molecular agents that could attack those targets and have a certain pharmacologic response. So that was what a lot of the innovation in the 80s and 90s was, that gave rise to lots of drugs that today are blockbusters and household names. So drugs that people take for hypertension, for elevated cholesterol, right? For depression. All of these were essentially products that came out of the innovation wave of the 80s and 90s around medicinal chemistry, high throughput screening technologies, etc. In the years that followed, there was another wave of innovation that had to do with more of biologics, right? And biologics are also drugs, but they're totally different, right? It would be like saying, you have a bicycle and you have an airplane, a 737. They're both transport mechanisms, right? But they're totally different, right? So biologic drugs are one or two orders of magnitude of greater complexity than small molecule drugs. And so there was an enormous amount of innovation in the 2000s and, probably, over the last 20 years around monoclonal antibodies, around recombinant DNA products, right? Around, essentially using cells, right? Mammalian cells or yeast cells as a biological factory to produce and express proteins that have therapeutic effect on the body. So you'll see in a lot of the drugs over the last 20 years that have been launched have been essentially biologics that have to do with, as I said, monoclonals or other kinds of, essentially, they're not molecules in the sense of synthetically derived molecules like there were in the 90s and 80s, right? And that innovation continues today. So you see a lot of the top drugs today, most of them are biologics. And that's where a lot of the innovation is occurring. And as you know, pharmaceutical innovation is a long life cycle innovation, right? It can go from 10 years from original concept through all the early testing up until it gets an IND and approval to test in humans, and then many years of clinical testing before it gets launched. What I see now, the next wave of innovation that's occurring is really, which is very exciting, is around, the whole cell and gene therapy. So again, of course, you have, the vaccines, cancer vaccines, right? And PDLs and PDL1s and et cetera that are changing cancer care. But particularly in immunology and oncology, there's the ability to essentially use gene therapy where you take viral vectors and you're able to alter the genetic makeup of the cell to be able to express different proteins within the body. So it's not like you're taking a biologic now, you're essentially changing the genetic code of the cells, or cell therapy where, which can be allogeneic or autologous, where you're taking cells, altering them in some way using carriers, injecting so it's getting to be much, so there's a whole another wave of innovation that's now at the cusp. And I think the next 10 or 20 years, the costs are still ridiculously high, but that will come down. So I think there'll be enormous innovation on the core biology, I think on the core technologies, on how do you improve the yields, the costs, and that will be the next, so that's just pharmaceutical innovation. Then if you look at med tech innovation, right, because I had the pleasure of working across the healthcare landscape, med tech innovation has a whole another set of very interesting things, right? In the old days, if you look at surgery has been completely transformed during our lifetimes, right? In the old days, if you had a valve defect, they would have to do an open heart surgery. It's like you cut the sternum open, like you open up a chicken, right? Kind of, and then you repair, and then you sew it up, and you have many lengths of days of stay in the hospital, and moreover, a very long recovery time. But now you can do that, minimally invasively. Mm-hmm. So a lot of surgery moved from open procedures to laparoscopic or minimally invasive. They're now going to endovascular. You now have the application of robotics. Yeah, I now see actually very interesting, I'm an investor in a company that has a very interesting augmented reality platform that the surgeons put this, this augmented reality sort of headset on, and that allows them to visualize in a better way and be more accurate.
Is it something you have integration with Da Vinci robot or something like that, or what?
Yeah, so a Da Vinci robot is one way, right? That's right. That you can basically have robotic surgery where a surgeon can, where you have a surgical plan and the robot is essentially, kind of navigating through very complex procedures. But the augmented reality platform is an alternative to robotics because robotics is quite expensive. And this is an alternative way to basically guide the surgeon towards very precise cuts, better balancing, perfect alignment. Right, without having to use expensive robotics. So my point is that the application of these different technologies to completely changing surgery, right? If you look at orthopedic procedures, for example, right, all of us, if we live long enough, we're going to need a knee implant, right? For all of us who have any kind of osteoarthritis or joint damage, right? By the time we get into our 70s and 80s, more of us will need these kind of products. But in the old days, you would need 2 units of blood, and you would probably have spent 4 or 5 days in the hospital. Nowadays, there's very little blood needed, right? There's tranexamic acid, there's other, agents that basically obviate the need for blood. And a lot of this can be done same day. You get a total knee replacement and you go home, if not the next day, even the same day. Right? So it's just almost miraculous, right? To see the advancements in surgery, the advancements from open procedures to, minimally invasive and laparoscopic procedures to endoscopic procedures. In general, kind of less acuity, right? That ultimately results in, better outcomes. If I look at the healthcare IT, right, there's the healthcare sector is probably a generation behind many other sectors in terms of its application of technology. And there's many reasons for that, having to do with the fragmentation of the provider system, the economic incentives, but I think that's changing now, right? In the United States, they passed a law around the ONC, which essentially required a lot of the existing vendors for interoperability. That makes it easier for people to get access to the data. And so what I see is that you're going to have this base record of information, which is the electronic medical record. But then above that base layer of data is going to be an intelligence layer that says, can I take this information and combine it and analyze it and use machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies to be able to add clinical value, to be able to do clinical decision support, not to replace the doctor, but to augment the doctor, right? And yeah, go ahead, Sanjiv. Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me well now?
That's better, yeah.
Perfect, sorry. So I had a good call with Nachiket Moore, who was the head of Gates Foundation in India last week. And we talked about this data itself. And I have some understanding, and we have done some work with IMHE and then work in evidence-based medicine too. So you and me both know data is very, very critical to our success. We even going to the point of when we are saying is data is new oil. And we are talking about hyper-personalization and everything. Do you see that happening in pharma industry in near future, where we get a prescription based on my DNA data or some other kind of microbiome to all other things?
Yeah, so I do think that there is increasingly personalization in pharma, and I'll give you examples of that. But there's also the liberating of that data and mining it for clinical value that I think is much broader than pharma, right? So I'll give you both examples. So in the case of pharma, this is especially true in certain diseases. So for example, cancers, right? I think people have realized that there are many, many subtypes of cancers.
Yeah.
So somebody has prostate cancer, and you can say it's slow growing or moderate or aggressive, but within that, there are so many subtypes. And as there's better understanding of those subtypes and genetic variations of cancer, there's a better understanding of what agents are more appropriate as first line or second line or third line therapy. So there will be increasing personalization. as you see companion diagnostics that are able to then judge, right? If you have a HER2 positive, then you get a certain therapy, right, versus others. So there will be increasing personalization of pharmacologic agents, right, for the pharmaceutical industry. But I see the role of data in healthcare as much broader than pharma, right? It actually goes into the right clinical decision support systems, right, to add an intelligence layer. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you're probably familiar. The markets are also starting to realize this. There was you probably have seen, Livongo, right, that just recently, they're a diabetes management company, right, that was worth, billions of dollars and just merged with Teladoc. So what I was saying is that the challenge in the healthcare system is it's incredibly fragmented.
Yeah. In
every country in the world, but especially the United States. And that's a function of how the healthcare system has grown up. So every hospital, it's got its own set of data. Every provider and physician has its own data, every lab, right? And the patients are there, and they don't really have not connected that well. And getting longitudinal records of data. And I think that is where there is going to be an enormous unlock of clinical value, where people are able to they have the base repository of data. But what I believe is that on top of that, there is going to be the intelligence layer that is going to be able to access and analyze and create a clinical intervention with that data. Mm-hmm. And I see that in every area of medicine. And then on top of that, you have an engagement layer where, that sort of engages the patient or the caregiver or, their spouse, right, or daughter or whoever the patient is, but also the care team, right, the nurse or the doctor in interesting ways. And so, for example, you must know of a company, right? I mean, Cerner, Epic, right? They are all big clinical, systems, right? But many years ago, they developed, for example, these agents, so in the ICU, patients, their systems are in the ICU. And patients in the ICU, if, this whole area of sepsis, you're probably familiar with.
Yeah.
So where you get infection and then if it's not detected quickly, if it's detected and managed quickly, it can be dealt with, right, with antibiotics or other therapies, and doctors can manage it. But if not, very quickly a patient can deteriorate, and it just cascades down into multi-organ failure, and then the patient basically is very critical or can die. And so they can really build these intelligence agents that just sit in the cloud, that are constantly monitoring these parameters, and are able to send an alert that says this is a patient who is at high risk of getting into septic shock.
Yeah.
That can trigger, this may be monitored anyway, but just through algorithms. It's just literally an agent running in the cloud. Similarly, right, in respiratory care or wound care, or, that's in the acute setting, or in the outside, in the post-acute setting, right, diabetes management, right, where you have now the closed loop, where you see these interesting technologies with continuous glucose monitoring. So I think there's going to be enormous innovation. As I said, I talked about innovation in pharmaceuticals with cell and gene therapy. I talked about innovation in med tech with new materials, changes in the operating room. You see some of these devices, and you look at, for example, cardiovascular devices that are a real passion of mine. And you see what used to be these massive ICDs, right? These dual chamber defibrillators, and how they've gotten so miniaturized. They used to last 2 years and 4 years and 7 years, now 9 years, and they get smaller and smaller. It's just fascinating, right, to see. Or if you look at, customized 3D printed implants, that's the other, very cool technology that's coming out. In the old days, you'd get a knee and it was like getting a shoe, right? Size 8, 9, 10, D, double E. But now I can get a custom built knee implant or spinal implant just for Ajay, right? Based off of a CT scan and a 3D printed N of 1 manufacturing, right? So I think a combination of all these technologies multiply. And so I see the next 2 or 3 decades as frankly more change and more innovation than the last 2 decades. And so it's a very exciting time
that's great
to be a participant in and shaping innovation in healthcare.
That is phenomenal for our audience, because they are looking for opportunities, they are looking for ideas. So there is some silver lining with all we are going through right now. So, Ajay, I'm on the board of TCNJ Innovation side, and they have this material science lab. And they're working on this material because they find there is not even a single material which can be exactly like the bone. Is it true?
Yeah, so all the orthopedic companies have spent a lot of time and effort to understand materials that can mimic bones. And God made bone to be a very interesting, I guess you could, I don't know, organ is probably the wrong word, right? But material. And why is that? It's because its strength to weight ratio is fantastic, right? If you throw a bone in the lake, it's going to float.
Yeah.
Right. But it has the strength to be able to support the human body. And so a lot of the work that's been done has been around alloys, has been around not solid, right? But they're all very porous. They're made to design, bone-like structures. And so I think it's a fantastic area where somebody can create, a material science where you can mimic the strength to weight ratio that bones provide. Bone, by the way, is a living organ, right? It's constantly resorbing and adding, right? You're getting bone cells that are dissolving into the blood, and then you're getting new, osteoblasts or whatever bones that are being formed. Mm-hmm. So it's a constant living tissue, and one that will be accepted by the body, right? It has to, the material has to not create an immunogenic response that's going to have the body reject it. I think would be, so all of these areas, right? Material science, microelectronics, sensors, processing, signal processing, data, processing, AI, all these technologies are additive and multiplicative, and that's what's creating this plethora of innovation possibilities, both in medtech as well as pharmaceuticals, but also the healthcare system and patient management for chronic disease or even acute care management in a hospital in a very interesting way.
So you think there will be a time when we will really do healthcare, not sick care, because the way I see healthcare system today, it is designed more for sick care. I get sick and then I go and see the doctor. My doctor has no clue or no understanding of what goes in between. In fact, I don't know if you have watched the live cast from Apple. They talk about a new Apple Watch where it can do 100 other things. It can capture tons of data and it can push the data to your doctor. So do you see that is going to happen in near future where we will be continuously monitoring our vitals, even oxygen level to glucose?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting concept, right? I would say that the sick care versus the healthcare, I think of it as a bit overly simplistic. So my general view is that there will always be a need for what you're calling quote unquote sick care, which is we will always need proceduralists who can do high quality surgeries. Mm-hmm. We will always need people in a hospital who can do the proper interventions when somebody has a broken bone in an accident or has pneumonia or, what have you, right? Somebody is going to need dialysis, right? So that does not go away. That will always be there and is an important part of the system. What I do think where the healthcare system has been evolving, although very slowly, is sort of value-based care, where right now the challenge the healthcare industry has is that the economic incentives are misaligned, right? Because of insurance, it ends up creating a very complex economic transaction that's unlike any other sector in the economy, mm-hmm. right? You essentially think of it as the very fundamental economic transaction in healthcare is different than most other sectors. Why? The analogy I like to give is, so I'll give you the example. The example would be, let's say you go to a grocery store and you buy a loaf of bread, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You go to the grocery store, you pick a loaf of bread, and then you pay the grocer, $4, and you pick up your loaf of bread, right?
Right.
That's the basic economic transaction in almost any sector. You go buy a car, you pay money, you get the car, right? Okay. In healthcare, the equivalent would be you go to the grocery store, right? You're the grocer, I'm the consumer. I go to the grocery store, but somebody else will decide what bread Ajay will buy. Okay. And yet a fourth person will actually pay you for the bread that I eat.
Okay.
So it's not just two people involved, right? In the basic economic transaction, there's a buyer and a seller, right? That's the basic economic transaction.
Right.
In the healthcare ecosystem, there's not a consumer and a seller, right? There are actually 3-4 other stakeholders involved. And so again, I go back to my bread analogy. If you had an ecosystem where I would go to the grocery store, but I don't decide what bread I buy, somebody else would decide, and yet somebody else would pay for my bread, and then you're selling the bread. You can imagine how screwed up the bread market would be, right?
Completely agree.
I'm obviously exaggerating, right, for effect, but the healthcare. So what people have tried to do over the last bit is to create more of a value-based system that aligns the economic incentives in a better way. That's one aspect, I think. The other thing that will happen is I think there's a need for a redefinition of what primary care is. I think what has become all too much of a challenge in the last 20, 30 years is because of the specialization of healthcare. The primary care has simply become a gatekeeper and a glorified administrative role. And I think there's an opportunity to completely reinvent what primary care is. And you'll see a few companies around the country that are already innovating on that model. And I've had the pleasure of knowing some of these very interesting companies, and they're totally innovating what primary care can be. I also think that chronic disease management is another area where there's opportunity for enormous innovation, where you have, whether that's diabetes or COPD or hypertension or hypercholesteremia, right, elevated cholesterol. These are all chronic conditions, and a better way to longitudinally manage these conditions to prevent complications. Right? If somebody has congestive heart failure, then doing the proper management of that disease upfront can save enormous downstream costs. And so, is the Apple Watch going to go change healthcare? It's kind of a nice thing. You can now monitor your oxygen saturation. How clinically relevant is it to bending the healthcare curve? I don't necessarily believe that. Now, obviously, underlying all this is this massive burden of disease in the country. And I think that has to do with, much more fundamental issues of terrible diet, terrible exercise, right? Human beings were not designed to consume the kind of food that the food industry puts out today, right? So with the high fructose corn syrup based products, with preservatives, so I think that, so I don't subscribe to this, sick care will become health care. I mean, I think there's aspects of it that are correct, but I think it's way too simplified. I think it's the elements that I would consider that will change is going to be more, alignment of economic incentives and value-based reimbursement and care in different ways, chronic disease management, redefining primary care, getting true centers of excellence for specialized care, getting better data and better decision-making, longitudinally, and getting more clinical evidence-based interventions as opposed to, economically driven interventions, because there is so much gray in medicine that, and there's such variability in clinical practice from doctor to doctor, and narrowing that clinical variability based on evidence. Those are the elements that I think are going to define the next 20, 30 years.
True. No, I completely understand and agree with you on that, Ajay. So let's switch this a little bit more and go a little more objective in terms of the opportunities. So you and me both know artificial intelligence is now everywhere. And I talked to 3 gurus from different major organizations in the last 1 week. And AI is there to solve literally every single problem. Seems like. On one note, we are talking about is AI is going to be a challenge, and they will be controlling the robots, and it's going to be a movie like Will Smith's movie, I, Robot. On the other end, we are talking about is we are not able to even solve a very simple fundamental problem is reading X-rays. Even today, all the images are read by people because we are using some AI, but the prediction level is very low. So in your experience and the companies you are working with, what do you see as a challenge there? Is it the technology problem? Is the data problem? Or we don't understand the human body, or each of us is different? What is really the challenge, and where AI can be really truly change our life?
Yeah, so I wouldn't profess to be an expert in, where AI may ultimately go and does it threaten the human race, et cetera. I know there are many people who have thought and talked about that topic, right? But from what I've seen, I do see a greater role for AI in healthcare across many, many parts that use cases will evolve over time. So I definitely see that at a disease level, at a specialty level, at a system level. And I've always felt that it's not a question of robots running the world or, some kind of, I don't think it's a question of man versus machine. The models that I've seen, I think, will always be man plus machine, right? So back to your example of reading an X-ray, you can get to models where over time you have enough intelligence and machine learning or pattern recognition built in. But it will always be a radiologist who is there to work with that algorithm to ultimately provide the right judgment, right? Now, will that mean that there may be less radiologists or less pathologists or whatever in the future? Yes, it's entirely possible, right? That there's some substitution, but the future will always be a combination of man plus machine. I don't see machine completely replacing man. And it's interesting. My wife is an internist, and we have these debates. And she says, "Oh, you're going to have but of course, they will never replace the clinical judgment of a doctor ultimately. But I think it will be better decision support systems and some way to supplement the doctors. And also, let's face it, there's very wide variability in clinical practice across many physicians. Sure. And the ability for an intelligence agent to be able to give suggestions to doctors or guide them or say, have you thought about this? Or, I was looking at one of these startups that has a very interesting technology around which antibiotic to prescribe if somebody comes into a hospital with an infection, right? Like, let's say a urinary tract infection and 3 different doctors may end up prescribing 3 different antibiotics that have different efficacy levels. Yeah. And so could a machine learning algorithm say, yes, here's something that's more likely to succeed, but ultimately it will always be the doctor's decision, So I do see that this combination is what will create the innovation that I see.
Yeah. On the same note, as one of my friend has a company called Dr. Evidence, and they have digitized, tons and tons of medical journals, medical data, and where they normalize it so you can do a better research. What kind of medicine is working better on what kind of Asian, male, Indian, or whatever, based on age, gender, our eating habits. It's just phenomenal data set is available out there. So I agree with you that we will start using more and more data to understand what works for Ajay and may not work for Sanjiv or John. But I want to change the topic a little bit and talk something a little more provocative a little bit. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the term global burden of disease. The term is coined by a person named Chris Murray. Chris runs the IMHE, and Gates Foundation has given him substantial amount of money. They have unbelievable petabytes of healthcare data. And his theory is, as a society, we have a burden. So we have to figure out a way how we can really take care of the people who are not taking care of themselves. So what is your take on that?
So are you referring to this as global public health? You mean in a lot of developing countries, or are you talking about the United States?
I'm talking in terms of as a concept, whether it is for United States or other countries or anywhere else. The point he's making is, if there are people who are sick and the society is not taking care of them, there is a challenge. And how do we solve it? And he has presented unbelievable data, which makes me believe that there is something we need to do as a person who can afford it.
Yeah, I mean, global burden of disease is certainly a very relevant concept, right? And the burden of disease varies dramatically, by country. I think you still have, large swaths of emerging economies that have poor access to the technologies and healthcare, capabilities that we have today. Mm-hmm. And the challenge in those situations is not just providing the technology, right? The medical devices or the pharmacologic agents, but it's also building the provider infrastructure and the specialist capabilities to be able to take care of those patients. right? In advanced economies, you have a different kind of disease burden. As I said, the biggest probably disease burden that exists right now is around the whole cardiometabolic syndrome, right? Because of just lifestyle-related diseases, right? That have to do with, whether that's diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease. Then you've got all the inflammatory-related diseases. You've got mental health and disorders, particularly amongst the kind of challenged populations in the United States. So I think the burden of disease and the nature of that burden is varies quite a bit by country, and then the approaches to deal with them also have to be local, right? One of our fundamental beliefs has always been that healthcare ultimately is local. There's no global solution to healthcare, right? Similarly, there's no pan-US solution to healthcare, right? Healthcare by definition, certainly the delivery system is definitely local, but also the reimbursement system, the incentives, the training, so of course, human biology is not different, right? But despite that, this ends up being, very local solutions to solve these disease burdens.
Thank you very much, Ajay. I can listen to you for hours and keep talking to you. This is really, really informative, and I'm sure our audience will learn some interesting areas, especially when it comes to systems thinking and when they can see the opportunities and how to analyze the opportunities. There are a plethora of opportunities. That's what I hear from you. McKinsey has the best research, so I trust your opinion on that too. And you are living and breathing this for more than 30 years. It's great for me, and it's very satisfying that people like you are moving the needle and changing the world. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you.